The elegy has been around since the times of ancient Greece. It had its inception in ancient Greece as a particular poetic form that probably would have been sung to a flute. When I say form, I mean that the elegy would be made up of alternating lines, dactylic hexameter followed by iambic hexameter. And so it would go. Uh, but the elegy certainly could lament the loss of a given person, but it could also be a poem about love or a poem about war. But still, there was this underlying sense that the elegy was ultimately a poem about loss. And certainly that is how the elegy, which comes from the Greek funeral song, has developed in the English language as a poem that can be on the loss of a particular person, as a poem that can be on loss in general, and a poem that considers that loss in such a way as to try to find a way to understand the loss, perhaps even work out of the loss. Now, it's important to note that the elegy is not a eulogy. A eulogy is a prose speech, monologue, given at a funeral, generally to praise the person who has died. It is not an epitaph, which is a brief statement that often finds its way onto a gravestone. And certainly, as we know, the elegy is not an ode, because an ode lauds, generally, its subject, whereas the elegy is mourning the loss of its subject. So one way to think about the ode in a general way is that it manifests in verse what Sigmund Freud called the work of mourning, mourning as in grieving. The idea that grieving is a process that one has to undergo over a period of time, and that this process is never easy, but that it is also necessary. So we might think of the basic ode structure in this way. The poet, because of the death of a loved one, or because of a sense of loss of something important, like childhood, say, the poet says essentially, I'm feeling loss. I'm sad. That's the starting point. But then the poet fairly quickly moves from I'm feeling loss to what is loss? What is the meaning of loss? What does it mean emotionally, intellectually to lose something? Then the poet makes another move. Something along the lines of what kind of language, what kind of figurative language, what kind of metaphor, what kind of imagery can I use to see this loss with clarity, to see this loss perhaps freshly, and ultimately to give a sort of life to my suffering. So given this movement, I'm feeling loss, what is loss? What sort of language can I use to see the loss clearly? Perhaps can this language pull me out of the loss? This generally ends up in a three-part structure to most elegies. And that would be lamentation for the loss of this person or thing, one. Two, praise of this person or thing, two. I should say person, thing, or state of being. And three, consolation. Put yet another way, we can say that the elegy in its essence is a poem about what is lost and what remains. What is lost and what remains. Now, there are basically three different kinds of elegy. The first kind that I'll note is the one that probably we're all most familiar with, and that is the elegy as a lament for the loss of a particular person. You'll see in our anthology by Mark Strand and Evan Boland, there is an elegy by Ben Jonson. He writes an elegy for his first son. Some of the more famous examples of elegies toward one person would be Walt Whitman's poem on the loss of Abraham Lincoln, "Oh, Captain, My Captain," which, if you saw Dead Poets Society, you're aware of. Another famous poem about the loss of one person would be W.H. Auden's poem in memory of W.B. Yeats, William Butler Yeats. Now, another kind of elegy, as I've suggested, is an elegy over a loss of a certain state of being. Just a basic feeling of sadness over the state of the world. And this kind of elegy had its start in the Anglo-Saxon age, the very early Middle Ages, as we would call them, in two Anglo-Saxon poems written in Old English. One would be called the Seafarer and the other is called the Wanderer, where the speakers are out in icy oceans, feeling alone and forlorn, and are wondering, where is my God, or where is my King? This feeling ultimately that they move through by saying, I'm suffering now, but I know if I have faith one day I will transcend this suffering because I will be in heaven. But these are brutal poems about fear and loneliness and cold and a feeling of abandonment and trying to find a way to gain solace in this world. Dover Beach would be an example of what I'm calling the general elegy, where we see a speaker who looks out of his window across the Dover Strait from Dover in England to Calais in France, and starts thinking about the ocean, and the ocean makes him realize that we live in an age where faith is gone, and there is basically no meaning. This is a realm of no love, no joy, no help for pain. The world is like a battlefield where ignorant armies clash by night. So what can we do in this valueless, cruel world? Well, we can love each other. And we're going to look at Dover Beach in just a minute as an example of elegy. Warner Maria Rilke, do you know elegies? 20th century. Another set of poems that really sort of lament the sadness that is existence, and wonders if there are sort of angelic beings in the world that might help us transcend this sadness. So that's the single person elegy, general elegy. And there's a third kind of elegy known as the pastoral elegy. And in this sort of elegy, the poet essentially pretends to be a shepherd and imagines the dead person as a kind of dead shepherd, and brings forth imagery of nature to mourn the loss of the dead shepherd, and often will invoke pagan gods and goddesses to come pay respects to the dead shepherd, and will ultimately try to find some kind of consolation. The most famous of these is John Milton's Lycidas, where the poet, as an uncouth swain, he calls himself, laments the loss of one of his friends from Cambridge, Edward King, who drowned. And ultimately the poem tries to move from pagan imagery, the pastoral imagery, to a more kind of Christian understanding of the world, and imagining the possibility that Edward King is now in some sort of space of eternal bliss. Another pastoral elegy would be Percy Bysshe Shelley's elegy for John Keats called Adonais. And yet another pastoral elegy would be Walt Whitman's other elegy for Abraham Lincoln, When Lilacs Last and the Dooryard Bloomed. So let's have a look at Matthew Arnold's Dover Beach to exemplify some of these ideas. Again, this would qualify as a more general elegy because we see Matthew Arnold's speaker in this 1851 poem not so much lamenting the death of a person, in fact, not lamenting the death of a person at all, but lamenting the loss of faith and the loss of meaning during his historical period. The poem was written in 1851. This was the year that Matthew Arnold was married. Some think that the poem was actually written during his honeymoon. Now, what makes this poem especially interesting as an elegy is that it's also a dramatic monologue. We saw dramatic monologues when we looked at Robert Browning. I think we talked about My Last Duchess, and we've looked at other dramatic monologues. A poem in which a speaker is assuming the presence of a listener. And so we can imagine this speaker in the poem is talking to his beloved. Perhaps it is his wife. We don't know. Is Matthew Arnold being autobiographical here? Did this really happen on his honeymoon in 1851? We don't know. But because the poem is a dramatic monologue, we actually are invited to understand the psychology of this person rendering the elegy. We're really invited to look at the complexity of his psychology. So we begin to see that not only is it about this person's mourning, but we understand that this person is mourning in a particular way. And in addition to the lament for loss, there's also look into the psychology of a person who would experience loss in this particular way. You'll see what I mean in just a minute. So it's not a very long poem, and we can go through section by section, and I'll just highlight some of the parts of it which I think are pertinent to, again, this shaping form known as the elegy in shaping form in poetry. So Dover Beach. Dover is in Kent, England, and it overlooks the Strait of Dover to Calais in France. Dover Beach, Matthew Arnold. I'll go through section by section again. The sea is calm tonight. The tide is full. The moon lies fair upon the straits. On the French coast the light gleams and is gone. The cliffs of England stand glimmering and vast out in the tranquil bay. Come to the window, sweet is the night air. So we start off with this lovely seascape. We can imagine the speaker, we can assume he's male, looking out the window, say, of a hotel or an inn. And, the sea's calm, look at it. And, the tide is coming in. We can see the sea coming up onto the shore. And the moon is beautiful on the Straits of Dover. And over on the French coast, I can see lights from, say, the harbor or people's houses. And they're gleaming. They're lovely light. And look, I'm seeing on the cliffs of England, they're glimmering and vast. So we have this sense of there's calmness and there's light. There are gleaming lights from France, glimmering light in England, and the bay is tranquil. And the speaker invites his beloved to come share the night air with him. What could go wrong? But then this single word, only, really shifts the poem. And it makes us ask, what kind of person would do this? What kind of person would call his beloved to look at a nighttime seascape that he thinks is beautiful and then start complaining about how terrible things are? So that's what I mean when I say this poem's a dramatic monologue in addition to being an elegy. So we're invited to ask, why would this person do this? What kind of person would render this sort of elegy? So, come to the window, sweet as the night air, he says. Come, my beloved. Maybe my new wife. We don't know, but maybe. Only. From the long line of spray, where the sea meets the moon-blanched land, listen, moving from sight to hearing. You hear the grating roar of pebbles, which the waves draw back and fling at their return up the high strand, begin and cease and then begin again, with tremulous cadence slow, and bring the eternal note of sadness in. So look, my love, only wait a minute, listen, do you hear the roar of the sea? It's the undertow is pulling pebbles back out into the water, and the waves sling them forward again, back and forward without sensation. And this is an unpleasant sound to him. It's grating. It's a roar. So there's a feeling here that the sea, the sound of the sea suggests not tranquility, but this grating roar, and also this repetition an endless repetition of back and forward, this sense of futility, this sense of monotony, of indifference to human concerns. And then he says, it makes me think of an eternal note of sadness. Now, these waves are not sad. Waves are waves. Natural phenomena occur. And sometimes humans impose upon natural phenomena human emotions. So the speaker is probably sad. The waves aren't sad. But he projects onto this grating roar sadness. So now there's a sense in the speaker that the world itself is sad because of this grating roar, this endless back and forth, monotonous, repetitious, indifferent to human desire. Why would he make this move? Well, he keeps going. He says, again, to his beloved, Sophocles, the 5th century Greek dramatist, famous for writing Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, famous Greek tragedian. Sophocles long ago heard it in the 5th century. I said that. Sophocles long ago heard it on the Aegean Sea, and it brought into his mind the turbid ebb and flow of human misery. We find also in the sound a thought, hearing it by this distant northern sea. So he imagines, Sophocles, back in 5th century BCE, heard this same sound. And he's heard in it not the eternal note of sadness necessarily, but the ebb and flow of human misery. Well, if we know anything about Greek tragedy, we know that pretty dark matter, in particular Oedipus Rex, where poor Oedipus kills his father and has sex with his mother, marries his mother, and ends up gouging his eyes out. Horrible. But there's a sense in Greek tragedy, not only by Sophocles, but also by Aeschylus, that we suffer, but out of suffering comes knowledge. Oedipus may suffer these awful things, but at least he knows who he is, and he knows who's responsible for the curse on Thebes. So I think that the speaker suggesting here that yes, Sophocles heard the same ebb and flow I'm hearing. He heard the same kind of misery I'm hearing, but yet, as opposed to the flinging imagery, sucking and flinging, there's a sense of ebb and flow for Sophocles, meaning that oppositions might come into conversation with one another, meaning we suffer, but we learn. We suffer, but we learn. We go blind in certain ways to gain insight in other ways. Think of Tiresias. In Oedipus Rex. He's physically blind, but he has divine sight. So what I'm saying is he's holding Sophocles up here as someone who could make sense of the misery, perhaps, by seeing in the ebb and flow a kind of rhythm where opposites interact with one another, not that grating roar that our speaker heard. We, he says, who's the we? Him and his beloved, him and his wife, or just all of us living right now in this time. We find also a sound in the sound of thought. So if Sophocles heard the ebb and flow of human misery, what do we hear? This is what we hear, meaning this is what the speaker hears. But you see how he's moving from the I to the we, as if wanting not to be alone? The sea of faith, this is the thought that the sea roar gives to him. The sea of faith was once too at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. So the sea of faith, he hears the sea of faith ebbing. Is this Christianity? Perhaps. Or is it a more general sense of faith in truth, beauty, goodness? At one time, the sea of faith was beautiful. It was like a kind of beautifully wrinkled, folded girdle. So think of the waves as being static. Think of the waves as being like curves in a wrinkled garment. So this is interesting because it suggests that when the sea of faith was around, it was highly artificial. It's the idea is that there was something kind of static about the sea. So the speaker seems to have it in his head that, well, if this water wasn't so rough, if it could just strike me as a sort of wrinkled garment, oh, then there would be no danger, and then the sea of faith would be full, and we would believe in beauty, truth, and goodness. But now that's gone. I just hear the melancholy. I hear the withdrawing roar. I hear the retreating of the waves. But of course, the waves fly back too. And I look around, and I don't see those gleams and glimmers anymore. I see vast edges drear. That's the shoreline. And naked shingles of the world. These would be the rocks on the shore. So the speaker's gone from seeing gleams and glimmers on the ocean, in the oceanscape, rather, Straits of Dover, to now seeing it as dreary and barren. Last stanza. We can imagine the speaker again looking to his beloved. Ah, love, let us be true. Ah, love, let us be true to one another. For the world, which seems to lie before us like a land of dreams, so various, so beautiful, so new, hath really neither joy, nor love, nor light, nor certitude, nor peace, nor help for pain. And we are here as on a darkling plain, swept with confused alarms of struggle and flight, where ignorant armies clash by night. So he's basically saying here, hey, beloved, let's you and I be true to each other, because the world's pretty terrible. Anything that seems beautiful and various and new is but a dream. The reality of the world is there's no joy, there's no love, there's no certitude, there's no peace, there's nothing good. And we're not even near the ocean anymore. We're on this darkling plain, a plain, and it's dark. And we're in the confusion of a horrific battle fought by ignorant armies who may not even know what they're fighting about. Man. So this is definitely an elegy that suggests, okay, this is an age where we've lost faith, and I've lost faith. And I see the world as a really terrible, terrible place. And I lament that. But I have you here, so let's love each other. There's a sense that interpersonal love, maybe romantic love, is all we have in this horrible world. So if there is any consolation in this bleak elegy, it is that we can at least choose to love each other. We don't need religion for that. We don't need faith for that. We don't really need beauty for that. We just have each other right here. So that's the movement of the elegy. But then there's this psychological part of the elegy, which makes me ask, what is this guy's state of mind? He seems a little unhinged to me, to go from looking out the window with his beloved to saying the world's a wasteland where ignorant armies are fighting. That seems a little hyperbolic to me. Seems over the top. It's as if this person is looking for things to be sad about. He seems mentally unstable to me. So strangely enough, the poem is also an elegy, I would suggest, a suggested elegy for this relationship. How long can a relationship like this last if on a honeymoon, say, the speaker is moving from wanting to have a romantic moment with his beloved to complaining about the world as a massive battlefield where ignorant armies fight and we're there in the middle of it. So that's Matthew Arnold in what I'm calling a general elegy. And his elegy is particularly interesting because it is a dramatic monologue as well. All right, that's elegy.